Slightly different video this week. I am sharing my webinar, HR's Guides to Neurodiversity. This is a deep dive into neurodiversity for HR professionals, designed to think about how we can support people to thrive, how we can manage disciplinary conduct situations, how we can create inclusive environments and build a business case. And I'm sharing it here for you because it was such important information on how we can support neurodivergent people in the workplace. So enjoy this deep dive. So for those that have just joined, I've just done a just a brief introduction. You haven't missed anything yet, just a run through of what we're going to be going through. So just to sort of let you know that we'll be covering everything that you need. You'll go away with specific tools on how you can support people in the workplace. So what does this mean? Why am I here? Why am I talking to you about neurodiversity? So a really brief introduction to me to get us started. And that is that my background originally was in HR. So I did my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in human resource management nearly 20 years ago, or over 20 years ago for my bachelor's degree now. So I've been working in HR for a number of years. And a few years ago, the neurodiversity became part of my radar because of being a mum. So it was my daughter that introduced me to neurodiversity by the fact that she is wonderfully neurodivergent. And I had to kind of learn what that meant, what it meant for her, and also understanding then that neurodivergence is in fact hereditary, and therefore discovering my own neurodivergence and all those years of saying, oh, well, she's just like me. Yes, she is just like me, and that explains a lot. The type of person I am means I'm very much a problem solver. I will dig in, I will figure out what's going on, and I will work out how you solve the problem. Now, actually, what I learned was neurodiversity and neurodivergence isn't a problem to be solved. It's a difference just to look at a little bit differently. But lots of looking, lots of studying, lots of reading, actually listening for me, because I tend to be an audiobook type person. And I started to figure out what this meant as a parent. I've started to figure out how I deal with this as a parent, but also then that started to overlap. And I started to think about that in terms of, well, what does this mean for us as people managers? How do we support people in the workplace? The numbers that we're looking at, about 20% of the population is estimated to be neurodivergent. That's pretty huge when we're looking at that from a workplace point of view. And I started to get questions on training. So when I'm doing management training, I'd get questions that related to neurodivergence. So that made me want to sort of dig in deeper. And I then went on to do formal qualification. So qualified last year as a workplace needs assessor, which is a bit like occupational health, but more in terms of looking at reasonable adjustments, but actually very different to occupational health in that it's a proactive assessment of somebody who is neurodivergent, looking at what supports can be put in place in the workplace to enable them to thrive. And in addition to that qualifying as a workplace needs assessor, I am just finishing off a postgraduate certificate in neurodiversity. And when I say just finishing off, my last deadline is next week. So I'm literally just in the final parts of that. And that's really opened up my eyes to a much wider look at neurodiversity, how it fits in within society, not just in the workplace. At the moment, I'm looking at it in terms of the criminal justice system, which is particularly interesting. And again, starts to relate some things back actually to how we deal with things in the work environment as well. So that's kind of my story. That's how I got to where I am today and why I'm talking about neurodiversity, and how I'm kind of linking that back to everything we do. And actually, as a HR professional, looking at it and saying, well, if we're talking about 20% of the population, that really means we can't do HR, we can't do people management without considering neurodiversity. As I am going through, and I'm just obviously going to dive in now to the content, as say to those that have just joined us, we're going to start with looking at what neurodiversity is, then on to sort of the reasonable adjustments and the business case, how we put this forward. And finally, I will tackle the question of how and when do we look at it as a conduct issue or deal with disciplinary issues where somebody is raising their neurodivergence as the reason for their behaviour. So diving into kind of what neurodiversity is and what this really means. So neurodiversity actually as a term is just a term to cover all of us, everyone. It's diversity is what it is, that we are all here, we are all part of the kind of rich diversity. When we come to neurodivergence, that's when we start to be looking more specifically at those that have what we call neurodivergent conditions or neurodivergent differences. A lot of people refer to. I often use the word condition because it's still medically diagnosed rather than seen as a difference, but it's important to consider that there are different people have different views about how language should be used. So disorder is commonly used in the medical profession. We don't generally use that in a work environment. A lot of people in the neurodivergent community don't like disorder being used. Condition is therefore more favourable. Difference even more favourable. And this is because it is a difference. It isn't purely a disorder. There are strengths that come with the various neurodivergent conditions. But firstly, what do we even mean by neurodivergence and neurodivergent conditions? And the truth is that there is not a consistently recognised definition of neurodivergence as a whole. So when I'm talking about it in this particular session today, I'm really referring to the neurodevelopmental diagnoses like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, four of the kind of most common ones. But we often see included in that definition those with brain injuries, depression, anxiety. So it can be a much wider definition. As I say, there's no actual consensus on what neurodivergent it actually is. I think it's wise to not have to include more widely everybody, and to include more widely mental health conditions, because often they overlap. There's often co-occurrences. We know that people who are diagnosed with neurodivergent conditions are more likely to experience things like depression or anxiety, or be misdiagnosed with those things as well. So it could be quite a challenging area from that perspective. But it's about recognizing that difference, that variety, that we all come into the workplace with a different perspective. We're coming in with different backgrounds and experiences. So when we're talking about neurodivergent conditions, in this particular session, I'm talking about it from the point of view of those neurodevelopmental conditions. So as I say, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, four of the common ones, but you've also got other conditions like Tourette's, for example, in there as well. And these are the ones we're most commonly seeing in the work environment. They're the ones where we see the most common challenges coming forwards. As I go through the session and sort of dive into this and talk around these things, obviously do feel free to put your questions into the chat as we're going through. I will also have a period at the end to do question and answer as well. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask me, please do feel free to put those forward. I'm not going to go into the specific conditions. I've only got an hour, so we're going to be sort of scratching the surface today. So I'm not going to be able to go into the specifics of things like ADHD and autism today. But what I am going to do is talk about the themes that we're seeing of challenges in the work environment. And the themes are actually important, and probably more important than looking at the specific conditions, because firstly, we know that the specific conditions are vast in themselves. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, so as against to neurotypical, so those who don't have a neurodivergent condition, we are talking about a much wider group of people and a much wider group of life experiences in the neurodivergent community generally than we are in the neurotypical community. And that's because of the wide range of experiences or symptoms, as the medical profession would call it, that leads to a diagnosis. So in ADHD alone, there are over 15,000 combinations of symptoms that could result in a diagnosis of ADHD. So that's 15,000 people who could be experiencing ADHD in a different way. And that in itself makes it a complex area. It makes it, I can't give you like this is ADHD, and this means that this is exactly what somebody will experience. And this is exactly the supports that they will need, because it's not as simple as that. It is very complex. And in addition to that, that complexity just in that one diagnosis, the research also tells us that it's unlikely that somebody will have just one diagnosis. We often find people have one diagnosis. You have one diagnosis and stop either seeking further diagnosis because it's so challenging to get a diagnosis. And in fact, until 2013, it wasn't even possible to get a dual diagnosis of ADHD and autism. The NHS NICE guidelines did not recognise that these two conditions could sit alongside each other. And that has created challenges for people who are experiencing what they've been diagnosed as a particular condition, when actually what they're experiencing is the behavioral traits, the symptoms, whatever words we want to use to sort of describe how the DSM, which is a diagnostic criteria, describes these conditions. The people are experiencing these really differently and may actually be experiencing more than one condition without realizing it. Research also tells us that even if people don't have enough traits for a diagnosis, i.e., to meet the diagnostic criteria, it's highly likely that anyone with at least one diagnosis will experience traits of virtually all of the other neurodivergent conditions. So when you start to see it like that, we start to see that there is a vast array of conditions that people are experiencing, of traits that they are experiencing, and then the impact of those are really going to vary on somebody and how they interact in a work environment or the world more generally, and the impact of what they're experiencing on that. So that's why I talk in themes rather than conditions when we've only got sort of an hour to go through, because these three that I've listed here on this slide are the three key challenges that we see people having. And these again are headlines, so there's a lot of challenges that sit within them. So executive function being the first one. If you've seen any kind of content on neurodiversity, neurodivergent conditions, executive function is a term you're likely to have come across. And these are the functions for us to be able to do things like prioritize, plan our days, our workload, our working memory. They're the things that most people, so those who are neurotypical, develop without really being taught. Nobody sits you down and teaches you how to plan, prioritize, or to remember the things that you need to be able to go to the shop and actually remember the things that you were meant to buy at the shop, those kinds of things. So executive function is the kind of basics in life. And I use inverted commas because for those of us that are neurodivergent, these are not the basics. These are the really complex things. So these are the things that cause the most challenges. And what's very difficult often for neurotypical to understand, people that don't have this experience to understand, is that they can see somebody do things that are really complex and then see them really mess up on the most simple of tasks. And that is where executive function comes in and where it becomes a real challenge, because these are the things that just enable us to manage, work through our days. So these are the things that we can use mostly tools for. So when I'm talking about reasonable adjustments, I'm talking about tools that support us in sort of planning, managing workloads, all of those kind of things. Then executive function, this is really what we're looking at. The other challenges that we see are social and sensory. So I've put social there rather than social skills, as it's often referred to, because it's not necessarily just about skills. It's about having a different way of interacting socially to many other people. So this can include things like challenges with eye contact. It can include things like challenges with sarcasm, humour, those kind of things, not taking things literally, so needing very specific kind of instructions. And that can make it difficult to build friendships, build relationships. Some people choose not to. Some people like to have big crowds of friends around them. Some people don't. Some people prefer to be solitary in the way that they work. Some people prefer to be in a big, bustling, open plan office. And this is what we mean by social. It's the differences in people's preferences and what they're looking for. And then some of those things are about recognition of what we expect in society. So eye contact, for example, we're often taught in school that listening means eye contact. It means somebody's actually looking at us, and that's how their sign that they're listening to us. We have to change some of those perspectives. So actually, that's not necessarily a sign that someone's listening to us. Eye contact can be very, very challenging. Actually, so can just sitting still and trying to listen to somebody speaking can also be quite challenging. So these are things that I mean by social. And then sensory challenges is another one. And these are things like experiences of light, heat, for example, experiences of noise. So being in a busy, open plan, noisy office could be really overstimulating for somebody. The overhead lights we have in offices, which I know are research backed in terms of making sure that we don't get headaches from looking at computer screens, but actually for some people they can cause headaches because of the sensory challenges and that they create. And so this is why we get challenges in offices where we're trying to accommodate lots of people in one space, because something that one person really needs, another person can find is a real hindrance and really makes them struggle. So that's kind of those headlines that actually, regardless of diagnosis, it's likely that people will experience one or all of those challenges. So executive function is generally consistent across neurodivergent, those with neurodivergent conditions. Executive function challenges. Social sensory tends to have a bit more variance as to the degree of challenges that they present. But these are also the things that can be really hard to recognize and understand. If they're things that we find simple, it can be hard to understand how somebody else doesn't. If I'm experiencing a room and a temperature or the lighting to be comfortable to me, it can be hard to recognize and understand that somebody else might not have that same experience of that same location. So it's about just being aware that actually everyone does experience the world differently. So you can see the challenges that this is bringing for people and potentially for us in work environments. And you can see why it can be challenging then for management to be looking at, well, why would we want to be considering this? Why would we want to be making adjustments to our office spaces, for example? And there is some very strong business reasons for doing this. So the starting point, obviously, I've got there is the minimizing the legal risks. There are increasing tribunal claims. So the 4 years up until the beginning of 2003, I think it was so 18 employment tribunal cases, and then the following year that went up to 103 cases in a single year. So from 18 in 4 years to 103 in a single year. And last year we saw one of the biggest payouts possibly ever, four and a half million paid out to somebody in a local authority who with ADHD and PTSD. So some pretty big tribunal claims, some pretty high risk claims, and therefore minimising legal risk shouldn't be considered low on the priorities. Having said that, nobody runs a business for compliance. So we need to start looking at, well, what are the other business benefits? And there are lots of them. So research has shown, including research by the CIPD, that we have increased productivity when we have diverse teams. We have increased creativity. We have increased psychological safety. And particularly when we have that increased psychological safety, we are much more likely to see the other benefits like the increased productivity. When we make environments accessible to people, we have reduced absenteeism, we have reduced staff turnover. If you've found a work environment that fits your needs and where you can thrive, particularly if you've struggled in other parts of life, then you are going to see that you're going to want to stay. You're going to see that this is a beneficial job. This is something you're not going to want to give up. So we see staff benefits and staff turnover, but it's not just that. It's not just in the individuals it's supporting. All of these things contribute to a generally safe environment, a general environment where people feel like they can be their authentic selves. So when they're then looking at, well, what do I bring that perhaps is a little bit different to other people in this environment, then they're feeling safe to contribute that as well, which again leads to that decreased absenteeism and decreased staff turnover. All of these things are great for your employer brand, for being able to promote that you are an inclusive employer. If you are going to promote that you're an inclusive employer, it's important to actually be inclusive. Otherwise, it's likely to do a lot of harm to your business. But we also know that there's increased unemployment amongst the neurodivergent community. Often this is because of things like struggles to get through job interviews. So job interviews require us to be at our best. They require us to sell ourselves. They require us to consider us to answer questions that are often not very literal. And so questions like, well, why would you be the best candidate for this role, would be quite a struggle for a neurodivergent person, particularly somebody who took things very literally in terms of, well, I don't know what the other candidates are like. Actually, I don't know if I'm the best person out of every person in the entire world, which is when you're thinking about questions like that very literally, can be really hard to answer, which is often why people don't get through interview processes, even though they may well be very good at the job once they got in there. So when we're inclusive, we've got inclusive processes and we've got inclusive supports for people in the business. We've also got access to that wider talent pool as well. And particularly at a time where we're struggling to recruit, companies are telling us that they're really struggling to employ people, then access to a wider talent pool is really beneficial. And I think it's important when we're talking particularly around things like neurodiversity, but also more widely in sort of DEI and other things, we're talking about well-being and things in HR often, that we put these forward as a business case, that these aren't about doing the right thing. They're not about, it's ethically the right thing to do, but we're able to put forward those business cases as to why actually this is good for business as well as being the right thing to do. So in practice then, what does this mean? And this is also a really good part of the business case. And that is that the reasonable adjustments don't need a huge amount. They are relatively cheap. Some of them are free, but most of them need a bit of mindset shifting. And that's probably the biggest barrier to putting reasonable adjustments in place. Some people who are neurodivergent will really understand themselves, understand their strengths, understand where their challenges lie, and know exactly what they need to be able to thrive, and will really be able to tell you that. Other people will find that much more difficult, and particularly people who are newly diagnosed, that they may well find that where they've been sort of masking for many years, often masking effectively means lying to yourself. And one of the biggest lies I tell myself is that I will remember the things that people tell me. And I won't. I need to write it down. If I don't write it down, I won't remember it. But these are the sorts of things that really important that we do learn about ourselves, and then we can put in place the things that support us, the things that can make things work. This is where workplace needs assessments come in. So I mentioned at the start that I qualified as a workplace needs assessor. If somebody is struggling to identify, possibly even identify where their challenges are, but certainly to identify where possible solutions might be, what things can help them to thrive in the workplace. That's what a workplace assessment is there to do. It's there to work with the individual to look at both their strengths and their challenges, so we can really promote their strengths back to their employer, so that the employers can lean into those strengths and get the benefits of them. And then we can talk about their challenges and look at how we can support those challenges. One of the things with neurodivergent conditions, and this is why we hear on the one hand, people are talking about this as a superpower, and on the other hand, they're talking about it as a disability. And that can feel quite confusing. And that's because neurodivergent conditions come with really extreme strengths and really extreme challenges. So whilst for neurotypicals, there tends to be a little bit more of an even playing field, and that you're sort of across the board consistently able to perform across different tasks and even on different days. For those that are neurodivergent, that could well vary. It can really go up and down. And that's one of the big challenges in terms of trying to understand what this really means, and also what it means to individuals for them to understand themselves as well. And that's why that's in workplace needs assessments, that's what we're looking at, and looking at the tools that we can recommend to be put in place. So some of the tools that we'll be recommending are simple are things like stationery, for example. A paper planner is my absolute go-to. If I do not have a paper planner, it's an absolute disaster because it has to be sat open on my desk. But on top of that, I also need technology because I need the beeps to remind myself that meetings are happening as well. So I need to make sure that I've set up meeting appointments with reminders in so that I actually know when things are happening. So that combination there can be really important, and that will vary for different people. So technology like speech to text or text to speech, both of those can be work differently for different people. Tools like Grammarly, for example, AI tools like ChatGPT. Some of these are free, and increasingly, actually, many of these are free. So we've got Microsoft, Google are really building into their tools. Apple tools like iPads and things can be really beneficial to really build in. They build in a lot of these needs and accessibility tools into the hardware, so we're not having to go out and buy lots of different softwares or sign up to lots of different softwares in the way that we used to. Some of the things that we're looking at are around the work environment. So say fixed desks is on there. So having your desk set up in a way that absolutely works for you can be really beneficial. For some people, that's just about the safety of knowing where I'm going to be when I come to work, the consistency of routine. For other people, it's around things like, well, actually, I need reminders. So if I put things away, for example, I will forget, out of sight, out of mind. So if I've got things like post-it notes reminding me to do something, I need them there and in my face, and therefore a fixed desk might be useful for that. Monitors that are going in certain directions between so your portrait and your landscape monitors, people have different preferences in how they lay out so that they've got visually everything they need in front of them. And that's where hot desking can be really challenging for those that are neurodivergent, and fixed desks might be a solution. Remote work is in there. Quite often when I'm talking to people in workplace needs assessments, I'm hearing that people like the balance. So they like to be able to come into the office where there's a bit of social, but they also recognise that they're perhaps not as productive in the office. They get distracted more easily, and their social battery runs out pretty quickly. So working from home on other days of the week enables them to do the focused work compared to work where they're actually discussing and engaged with other people. For others, remote work all of the time is more necessary. People really struggle to be in any kind of work environment and really like the sort of solitary working from home. I didn't realize that was me until lockdown, when all of a sudden I'd got a house full of people because I was working remotely before lockdown. So that's when I learned that actually, yes, I do very much prefer a lot of my time to be working on my own, and I need that to be able to focus and concentrate. But as I say, different people are different, and we are really seeing that whilst these things are there, what I'm not saying is for every neurodivergent person, these are your solutions. These are just a toolbox of options that could be available to people. Things like additional breaks I've got in there, focused time. So there's some specific things that could be in there. Focused time could be putting your headphones on or going in from an open plan office into a smaller booth, for example, to be able to focus and work. Different ways of working suit different people. And then there's things there around communication styles, management styles, and that's when it comes down to that change in mindset, making sure managers have got that got the training. We know, again, from research that a large proportion of people, so 53% of people said that they would not disclose their neurodivergence at work. So unlike the sort of views that this is being over sort of disclosed and people are overly talking about it, the evidence tells us it's the opposite. 53% of people won't disclose this at work. They'll be afraid to. We also know that disclosure is beneficial when the person they're disclosing to has empathy, has some understanding. They don't need a lot of understanding, but just some understanding, enough to listen, and are willing to sort of change their management style, reflect, and actually work in the way that works best for the individual. So that can include things like how we give out instructions, how we give feedback, as well as things around how we set meetings, how we when we expect people to come to meetings, whether we expect people to be in the office, those types of things that come into how we manage and support people in the workplace. So there's a number of kind of reasonable adjustments there. And I think the biggest challenge often people have is not knowing what options might be available to them, what they can ask for, or even what might help. And say workplace needs assessments can be really useful for that, but also so can just talking to the individual and really seeking with them. So some people will know really well what works for them, probably because they're very used to having worked like this before. They've possibly even gone through things like workplace needs assessments in previous job roles, which can also be beneficial. And this is a really challenging one. So this is where we're in a conversation with somebody, perhaps we know they're not performing or there's a conduct issue, and we're trying to work out, can we deal with this as a disciplinary when we already know that there is a neurodivergence there? Because we know that neurodivergence comes under the definition of a disability under the Equality Act. Certainly, if somebody's met the diagnostic criteria, they're almost certainly going to fit that definition of a disability. And it's highly likely that somebody who is self-diagnosing as well will also meet the definition of a disability. So it's always worth considering that point. And we know that we can't treat somebody less favourably because of their disability. We know that we have to put into place reasonable adjustments. That doesn't mean that we have to accept everything. So I will look at the case of Greg Wallace, for example, who has said, oh, well, I behave like this because of my autism. Pretty sure Elon Musk might have used the same excuse at some point as well. And some of these behaviours are not behaviours that we can accept in the workplace. And the good news is that we have got tribunals that are showing us, we've got the case law to say that where it is a reasonable outcome, it's a reasonable decision, we can make decisions to even dismiss people, even where they're putting their behaviour down to autism, for example, which is actually the couple of cases that have come up have been autism. There's actually one around dyslexia as well. So I'll give you some of those examples. So what is it that we're looking at? How would I deal with a situation if somebody is saying to us, well, actually, this is due to my neurodivergence? Firstly, it's really around identifying the cause, identifying exactly what we are looking at. So really to being able to unpick and understand the situation that's happening. And then separating out sort of reasons from excuses. So these are often what we're looking at when we're dealing with performance issues. Ideally, somebody who's neurodivergent comes to us at the beginning of their employment. They tell us that they are neurodivergent. We then sit down with them, either through a workplace needs assessment or through just sitting with them as their manager and saying, okay, what do you need to thrive? What adjustments can we put in place? And we put those in place and things work, and it works out well for us. Often that's not the case. Often performance issues come up and then neurodivergence comes up, particularly at the moment where people are just realizing this for themselves. So that's our first step, is to look at, okay, what's the cause and what could we put into place to be able to support somebody? And that's what we mean by those reasons or excuses. So let me give an example that's not neurodivergence, but if you haven't met me in person, you won't know that I'm not even 5 foot tall, which most of the time doesn't cause me any issues. But back in the day when we had paper filing rooms, so like literally rooms of files all round, Some of those files would have been too high for me to reach. And back in the day, they didn't put steps in those rooms because they kind of expected it was probably mainly men that were going to be in the office, and that's fine because they'll be able to reach them. And that meant I often had to go and ask somebody to get the files down for me. So when we're looking at reasons or excuses, we're looking at, okay, if we look, excuses would be, well, I can't get the files. Somebody else has to do it. I can't do it. End of. A reason is that the files are up there. I'm down here. I can't physically reach them. But if you were to just get a step in the room, I'll be able to do all of this work on my own, not interfering with anybody else or asking anybody else for their support. And so we can put in place a simple, reasonable adjustment, or it's not a disability, but it's an adjustment of a step in my situation, and that's going to solve all my problems. So that's partly what we're looking for in terms of reasons and excuses, is we're looking at, is somebody working with us to try and solve this? Are they working with us to try and figure out how we can ensure that they can thrive and they can do the job to their fullest ability? So then that gives us those questions. So will reasonable adjustments solve the problem? And sometimes they will. Like in my situation, a step literally would solve the problem. Other times it might solve it enough, but not quite. There might be some other things that we need to do, or we need to look at, well, actually, perhaps we can't really solve this. Perhaps this person's not going to achieve this, but actually there's strengths over there. Perhaps there's some other things that we can do. And these are all the variations we're looking at in terms of inclusivity, reasonable adjustments, and how we enable people to be in the workplace. But there are times it goes beyond that. So if somebody's not willing to take on the reasonable adjustments, for example, if even with the reasonable adjustments, they're still not able to perform at the level that's needed, there's not necessarily an expectation to reduce standards. Again, it's going to come down to a case-by-case basis as to what is reasonable in situations. And then particularly when it comes down to specific behaviours, that's when we can be looking at what is reasonable or not to accept. So to give you some examples from the tribunals, there was a case, it was a Lloyd's Banking Group case, and there was somebody with dyslexia who asked a question, and that question, they were in a diversity training, I think it was an awareness training, and they asked a question that involved the M word. And they were dismissed for using that word in the work environment. Now, the tribunal in that situation said it wasn't reasonable to dismiss because this person had dyslexia, which means their processing speed, their working memory were not going to be at the level of other people. And they asked a question in what they believed to be a safe learning environment. Now, yes, they should have been informed that that word should not have been used, or that they could use other ways to express their question, but dismissal was not proportionate given the environment, given the way the question was asked. It should have been a reasonable adjustment to consider that this person had genuinely asked that from a learning perspective, and that it was their processing speed that meant that they asked the question in an inappropriate way. There is another case, however, Buckinghamshire Council, this one, and this is where a social worker, I think she was, said that her behaviour was influenced by her autism, and what she did was she gave a gift to a child. There was training in place to say that you don't do this. This is a massive safeguarding risk. It's considered a really high safeguarding risk to give gifts to children when you're in that type of position. And she was dismissed, and the tribunal said that it was justifiable and proportionate to dismiss her given the safeguarding risk, but also given that she'd had the safeguarding training. It's been specifically given to her, written out for her as well as to what was expected, and therefore autism couldn't be used as a defence that would have meant that she shouldn't have been dismissed. Now, at the same time, there was also a finding of harassment because the written outcome of her appeal stated, and I'll read this one out, "It is of great concern that you chose to withhold your autism through masking throughout much of your employment, potentially putting at risk the vulnerable children with which you were working." And that was deemed to be harassment, that single statement. So masking, if you've not come across that term, masking is where people try to behave in a neurotypical way. They try to behave in a way that fits in. Now, in reality, we all do this to a certain extent. When we go to work, we put on our telephone voice and things like that to fit in and do what's expected of us in a work environment. But those who are neurodivergent do this a lot. There's a lot of trying to fit in, trying to behave in a neurotypical way. And the implication from this statement was that she had attempted to be deceptive in masking, and it would be unreasonable to consider that masking was an attempt to be deceptive. It is, in fact, it's an attempt to fit in, an attempt to do what is right and is expected of somebody. So hopefully you can see there that there is a line from tribunals, and as I say, there's an increasing number of tribunal cases going through, which means we've got more and more case law that's giving us more and more answers around what is reasonable, what isn't reasonable to accept. But we have to consider the circumstances. So we have to consider whether somebody has asked something in training or maybe in a team meeting, maybe it's a slightly clumsy way of saying it, but we can see that there was no offense or malice intended. We can see that this person is remorseful. That would be something we are looking at as well, compared to a situation where actually the risk is so high that it is justifiable and reasonable for an employer to be dismissing. And in which case we wouldn't be using, say, autism as an excuse or a reason even for this to have happened, to say, well, okay, in which case you won't be dismissed. We are looking at the risks to the business going forward. Is this person likely to do this again? Is this something that creates high risk? And so when it's safeguarding, that is going to be the case. So those are going to be the cases where disciplinary action is fair, and we shouldn't be afraid of dismissing somebody. Neurodivergence is not an excuse for everything. It's not it doesn't make us different in expectations of behavior, particularly when it comes to things like bullying, harassment, for example. Yes, we need to look at why we've got expectations of behavior. So if your expectations of somebody is that they will make eye contact with you, that's going to be unreasonable. If your expectations are that they are not going to harass you, then that is going to be reasonable. So it is looking at those kind of case by case basis, but we shouldn't be afraid. And say the case law is increasingly giving us examples of how and when disciplinary action and dismissals would be appropriate and relevant.